In Chapter 6, we'll be discussing memory. So what is memory, and what are the different types of memory, and how do we develop memory, and how do we forget? Things of like topics like that. So first of all, a good definition of memory, that's a group of related mental processes that are involved in acquiring, storing, and retrieving information. So those three words right there, acquiring, storing, and retrieving information, those are very important to memorize. So three terms here. These are the three fundamental processes of memory. First term is encoding, and that is when we are taking in information and starting to process it. That is the transformation that occurs in the brain into a form that can be entered and retained by the memory system. So that is usually neurochemical, and that actually encodes it into a type of language that can be stored and retained by the memory system. Now, we also, memories, after we encode them, we store them. And that storage, that refers to just retaining information in memory. So we can use it at a later time, can retrieve it. And lastly, the term retrieval, and that refers to basically remembering. When we generally just say, "Oh, I just remembered that," we're actually referring to the fact that we retrieved it. So retrieval just means recovering stored information for conscious awareness. And we're going to talk about the stage model of memory. And so when information is transferred from one memory stage to another, that's called stage model. And so the first one is sensory memory, and that's when we basically a great deal of information from the environment is remembered, is memorized, stored, and processed and in our memory. And then there's what's called short-term memory, and that temporarily holds all the information we're currently thinking about or that we're aware of. And we'll take a little bit more of an in-depth look into that just here in just a moment. And last but not least, we're going to take a look at long-term memory. And so that is long-term storage of information, and that usually can usually last, that storage, for a lifetime. So sensory memory, that is very short-lived. It's fleeting impressions of our environment, the world, they say here. And so that's real brief storage of sensory impressions. Because we are bombarded with so much sensory information constantly, sounds, sights, feelings, that we cannot be conscious of all of them all the time, and we cannot memorize them all the time because we're just constantly bombarded with so much of that. And there's certain types of sensory memory here that we'll want to be aware of here. The first is visual sensory memory. And remember, visual, that just means, our sight, what we see, memorizing what we see. And that's also known as iconic memory because it's the brief memory of an image, which is also known as an icon. And second, we'll talk about auditory sensory memory, and that is basically what we hear. Auditory refers to what we hear, and that's also known as echoic or echoic memory, and that's a brief memory that is like an echo. And those usually only last, like 3 to 4 seconds. Now, last year we'll take a look at auditory sensory memory, and so that is actually the same thing we just talked about. So we will move on from there. The short-term working memory. Okay, so short-term memory is also known as working memory. And so basically that is it's the temporary storage for information transferred from sensory and long-term memory. And usually that lasts about 20 seconds. So our working memory is it can be, although it's usually lasts for about 20 seconds, while we're paying attention to it, that can be retained longer through a process known as maintenance rehearsal. And you can see that I actually highlighted that term in red. On these slides, everything that I highlight in red, I feel is most important to pay attention to. So maintenance rehearsal, that just means mental or verbal repetition of information. So take, for instance, someone tells you their phone number, and so before you can get to a pad and write it down, you'll say it to yourself over and over in your mind. That's called maintenance rehearsal. And so I'm going to move on here to from short-term memory to working memory. And so this model of working memory, that basically is this person named Baddeley here, they just said that working memory and short-term memory are basically the refer to the exact same thing. So working memory refers to the active conscious manipulation of temporarily stored information, and that's what's important on this slide here. So long-term memory, that's information that's stored longer than for 20-second duration of short-term memory. And long-term memory, that that can be unlimited, and both in the amount and the length of time. That's why they call it long-term memory. Now, for getting information and actually encoding that into your long-term memory, remember we discussed earlier maintenance rehearsal, like saying something over and over again. They have found that maintenance rehearsal is not very effective for encoding long-term memory, but elaborative rehearsal has been found to be most effective. And so basically what is unique about elaborative rehearsal is that actually focuses more on the meaning of the information and what it means to you in order to encode it and transfer it into your long-term memory. So, and they mentioned one last thing here that also relates to the information, to other information you may already know. So take, for instance, if it's in the studies of memory here, you will tend to, once you've developed a strong foundation of the different types of memories, then when you learn a little more details about certain types of memory, because it's related to something you already know, that will actually be tend to get more into your long-term memory. That's what that refers to. Okay, so for encoding long-term memories, and here are some hints for studying that based on encoding strategies. And so I'm not going to read all these. I'd like for you to stop the video and take a look at each of these on your own. Okay, and so the types of information in long-term memory, there's 3 different types of information in your long-term memory. There's what's called procedural memory, and that refers to our memory of how we perform different skills, operations, and actions. And we generally just call that muscle memory. The second type of long-term memory is called episodic, and that's the type of memory that refers to events or episodes, including the time and the place, And so that can be, when what you remember something about the day and the time and the surroundings and everything when something really important to you occurred, that specific episode. And finally, we'll discuss semantic memory, and that is knowledge of facts, names, definitions, concepts. So, in memorizing the information in this chapter, you're actually you're relying upon your semantic memory because you're more focused on facts and definitions and concepts. Okay, and there are two systems of long-term memory. One is called explicit, and explicit memory, you see I highlighted that red, it's on the left. That is memory with awareness. And so that's information that you can actually consciously recall or remember. And that's about, facts, knowledge, school, work, that kinds of thing. Now, on the right here, it looks at implicit memory, and that's memory without awareness. And that's information that is more task oriented. And that is stuff like motor skills and action. And as we referred to earlier, muscle memory type. So those are the two types of long-term memory. So sometimes there's certain ways that you can that information is organized in our long-term memory, and one way is known as clustering, and that just means remembering things that are related to each other. They're clustered together. Here's an example of clustering. And so it would be really hard to memorize this entire list. But if we actually clustered into categories, like I'm looking at this right now, and I'm seeing things like chair and footstool, and later on, I think there's a lamp and a dresser and a sofa. Well, that's all furniture. And then another category on here, there's boat, train, bus, so that's vehicles. And so that's another category. And then finally, I'm seeing things like plum, grapes, orange, pear, and that's fruits. And so if you actually cluster those into their appropriate categories, that will actually help you get that into your long-term memory easier. And another thing that really helps us to remember to retrieve information from our memory is what's called retrieval cues. And a retrieval cue, that's a clue or a prompt or a hint that can help trigger recall. So that could be anything. So take for instance, you don't want to forget something and you want to be able to do that later on in the day, you may jot down on a piece of paper or something, a quick note or something, and even just a word or something, and that would actually function as a retrieval cue. Now, there's certain types of ways, that we may have problems with our memory that they call those retrieval glitches. And here's an example of something we all experience quite often. It's called the tip of the tongue experience. That's having the feeling like, oh, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I know that, but I just cannot retrieve it. I cannot remember it right now. And so that's one way that we experience glitches in our memory. Okay, so now here's certain things that actually, here's another way that things that affect the way we remember things. And one is called the serial position effect. And that's our tendency to remember items either at the beginning or at the end of a list better than the items in the middle. So take, for instance, if you go to a concert, a music concert or something, usually you'll tend to remember like the opening music and then how they ended the concert, but all the stuff in the middle, and same thing with movies and things like that. And so there's two parts to that. They referred to the stuff that was the first in the list, the stuff that occurred first in the event. That's called the primacy effect. Whereas the stuff that occurs at the final part of the event or at the list, that's called the recency effect, because that's what happened most recently. It was the last thing to occur. And now they refer to another thing that will affect our memory, and that's called encoding specificity principle. All that refers to is when the conditions of retrieval are similar to conditions of encoding, retrieval is more likely to be successful. So that just means basically, that occurred in the same setting or the same environment, or even you're in the same mood, that will actually tend to help with us with remembering and encoding into long-term memory. Now, flashbulb memories, those refer to very specific details or images about a significant, rare, or vivid event. So they give some examples here. And one example I like to use is take, for instance, a sudden car crash that you witnessed, that you actually saw. That could be a flashbulb memory. You'd remember, like which car ran into which car and how did it happen, and the events that were surrounding that scenario, that kind of thing. That's what's called a flashbulb memory. Okay, and now we're going to talk about forgetting. And this researcher named Ebbinghaus, he developed something called the forgetting curve. And so I highlighted in red what I feel is important to remember. And he stated that much of what we forget, we usually forget it very soon after we originally learn it. So a great majority of what we actually learn, we will very quickly forget a large majority of it. And how quickly we forget that material depends on how well the material was encoded in the first place. So how meaningful that material was to you and how often you rehearsed it once you learned it. So those are important for remembering and forgetting. Now here's an example. Here's an actual graph, and I actually left this here in our presentation because I feel it's important to see that you could see this was Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. And what that refers to, you can see right there on the far left-hand side of this, that usually immediately after learning something, we will tend to, if you look down here, look down on the left-hand side there on the purple or blue line, whatever you perceive that, it goes all the way down to under 40%. So we actually forget over 60% of what we learn almost immediately. And then 2 hours later, it drops down to we only tend to remember 30% of what we learned. And then 6 hours later, it's only 25%. And that progresses. So what's important is to learn from this and remember from this is we tend to forget very quickly the things that we learn unless we actually revisit it and actually practice it a few more times or repeatedly until it actually gets encoded and stored into our long-term memory. That's why when you study, reading through the chapter just once or looking at the PowerPoints just once, that does not ensure that you will actually remember the majority of the material. So why do we forget? So one of the most common reasons for forgetting is when information is not encoded into our long-term memory. So basically failure to remember what needs to be done in the future, that's called prospective memory error. So that just, and that is very common. When some, like, say, take for instance, you were leaving in the morning for work, and you think to yourself, oh yeah, don't forget to do this later on today. Well, generally that doesn't occur. We tend to forget that, and that's called prospective memory error. So, looking further into why we forget, there's something that's called decay theory. So when a new memory is formed, it actually creates, distinct structural and or chemical changes in our brain. And so that's neurochemical and neurophysiological changes that occur in the brain when we form new memories. But those memories can actually fade away over time just as a result of normal brain processes, and that can be just because the brain is, constantly working and exerting effort and everything. And so certain parts of those, neurophysiological connections and things can fade. Okay, so we're going to take a look at here what's called interference theory. This is another thing that will interfere with our long-term memory. So actually, memories can interfere with memories. So that's an important thing. And so if I'm going to take down here, we're going to take look down a little further to the terms I put in red. And here's are the two types of interference that can occur. One is called retroactive interference, and that's when a new memory interferes with old memories or old information. So if you've ever were trying to remember something and then suddenly someone says something to you like, oh yeah, don't forget this too. And then all of a sudden you cannot remember that, your old memory that you were about to retrieve, that's called retroactive interference. Now, on the other hand, proactive interference, that's when an old memory interferes with the remembering new information. So if somebody is talking to you about something that they would like for you to remember, but you keep saying, "Oh darn, I cannot remember that because I keep thinking about this," an old memory that you have encoded and it's strongly entrenched in your brain or your mind. Okay, so another thing is called motivated forgetting. And so that's undesired memories that are held back from your awareness. And there are two types of those. One is called suppression, and that's when one consciously forgets. So an example of that is when something bad happens to a person, they may say, well, I definitely I will not I do not want to think about that, and I do not want to remember that. So they are engaged in what's known as suppression. Whereas repression, that is an unconscious forgetting. And so again, an example would be something terrible happened in life, and an individual, they just cannot remember it. That is called repression. Now, memories are not perfect, so details can change, so even without being aware of it, details can be added, subtracted, exaggerated, downplayed. So definitely, this refers to the idea that one should not always immediately just take for granted that their memories are perfect, that that what they are remembering is exactly what happened. Now, I'm going to refer to a term here called source confusion, and that's what happens, that arises when the true source of the memory is forgotten or when a memory is attributed to the wrong source. And that can actually result in what's called false memory. Now, here's a good example. You say, well, I remember exactly how that happened. It was when so and so said this to me. when actually maybe that's not correct, and the actual right source of the memory might have been something that one read in a magazine or heard on the news or something to that effect. So that's called source confusion. Just cannot remember the correct source of the information. Now, definitely imagining an event, even if that's one that never took place, that can actually help create memories. And so this just shows you how that can happen. Feel free to pause the video at this point and look at this chart to gain a little more insight. And I left this in here too, and I highly recommend you pause the video and just look at this. This is all the factors that can contribute to false memories. Okay, so processing memories in the brain, so definitely these are what they call clues from amnesia. So amnesia, that's severe memory loss. And there are two types. This was called retrograde amnesia, and that's the inability to remember our past information, past episodes, things that happened in our past. And that is usually very common after a head injury. And there's another type of amnesia, what's called anterograde amnesia. And that's the inability to form new memories. And that is usually related to damage to one's hippocampus. And so they mention a term down below here, and that's called memory consolidation. So that's this gradual physical process of converting new long-term memories into stable, enduring memory codes. So what is important to think about in regard to that is memory consolidation occurs very gradually, and it is a process that is usually happens through repetition and constantly revisiting the information, thinking about it. And things that can disrupt consolidation of memories are head injuries. So they show this here. Moving on though, and then these are the brain structures so that are involved in memory. So definitely some important ones here. We've got our prefrontal cortex that memorizes, the sequence of events, things how they happened. Now the amygdala, that is what encodes our emotional aspects of our memory, and our hippocampus, that encodes and transfers new memories to long-term memory. And then the cerebellum, that's memories involving movement. So you can see that memory and all the different types of memories, those actually occur, they are processed and stored in all throughout the brain in different areas. So that concludes our discussion on this chapter about memory.